All right, joining me once again here on the Matthew Filipowicz Show is my good friend Ari Berman. Ari's work has appeared in the New York Times, Rolling Stone, The Guardian. He is, of course, a contributing writer for The Nation magazine, which you can find at thenation.com. You can also find him on Twitter at Ari Berman. Ari, thank you so much for being on the show again.
Thanks for having me back, Matt.
So, Ari, you currently have a cover story up at The Nation entitled, "Why Are Conservatives Trying to Destroy the Voting Rights Act?" The Supreme Court is due to hear a challenge to the Voting Rights Act at the end of the month on February 27th. Let's begin by discussing the history of the Voting Rights Act and why it was and continues to be so very necessary.
Sure. Well, obviously, there's a long history of trying to suppress the vote in this country in many different ways. The Civil War ended in 1865, and the 15th Amendment was passed in 1870, which was ostensibly supposed to give the right to vote to Black Americans and to other minority groups, including newly enfranchised slaves. But what happened is shortly after the passage of the 15th Amendment, we started to enter the Jim Crow era. Federal troops left the South in 1877 as a result of a compromise over a disputed presidential election. And then what happened is southern states which had elected, following the Civil War, black congressmen and black senators, these states started passing new voting restrictions. Thus, the Jim Crow era began. And basically, from about 1890 to 1965, there was no right to vote for Black Americans in the South. And so that's what made the Voting Rights Act so necessary.
What's crazy to think about is that just in 2006, the Voting Rights Act was actually reapproved, and it was reapproved overwhelmingly by both the House and the Senate. I mean, the Senate voted 98-0 to reapprove the Voting Rights Act, and that was 2006. And it's just crazy to think about how much has apparently changed between 2006 and today in 2013. Something has changed, and repressing votes is now apparently a mainstream right-wing position.
Yeah, well, it's really interesting. The Voting Rights Act has been reauthorized 4 times by Congress, most recently, as you mentioned, in 2006. And each time the reauthorization has been signed by Republican presidents, which doesn't mean that there hasn't been opposition to the Voting Rights Act from the very beginning on the right, because there has. But the point is they weren't able to do so because there was such bipartisan support for the Voting Rights Act. And what's happened is the position of the GOP has really shifted, and it shifted for a few different reasons. I mean, number one, the GOP itself is just more Southern, more conservative, and more white than it was even as recently as 2006. The second thing is we've seen really an intensification of voter suppression efforts by conservatives as a response to demographic change. You know, after Obama's election, when he won 80% of the growing minority vote, this is when you really started to see voter suppression efforts escalate. And so clearly they want to get rid of a key portion of the Voting Rights Act, Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which compels parts or all of 16 states with a history of voting discrimination to have to clear their election change with the federal government. And it was under Section 5 that the Department of Justice and the federal courts were able to block things like Texas's voter ID law and Texas's redistricting maps. And so states like Texas, South Carolina, Georgia, North Carolina, et cetera, want to be able to pass these new voting restrictions without this sort of federal oversight. And then you've also had this campaign where top right-wing donors, including Charles Koch, are pouring millions of dollars into these foundations, and principally into one foundation known as Donors Trust, which is backing this conservative legal foundation that is bankrolling this challenge. So you really have a whole infrastructure set up to find plaintiffs to challenge the Voting Rights Act and then to pay for those lawsuits with very high-profile Washington attorneys. So this is a very thought-out campaign against the Voting Rights Act on many levels.
What's so sick and nefarious about it? And again, you know, Ari, you've been on the show several times talking about this and reporting on the GOP's war on voting. But what is so crazy is really how much money is behind this fight and this war, how much money is being spent to stop people from voting, to stop people from exercising their basic rights in a democracy. When do we get to some of the groups and the organizations who are behind the lawsuits? You mentioned earlier the wonderful Mr. Koch. There was another man, a man named Ed Blum, that people, they may not be familiar with him, but it's a name that people should know. Tell us all about him.
Yeah, so Ed Blum runs this organization called the Project for Fair Representation, which is a conservative legal defense fund. I guess you could sort of think of it as like the evil twin of the NAACP legal defense fund. Instead of protecting minority voting rights, he's trying to undermine them. And Blum is someone, he's a former stockbroker. He's not a lawyer, but he ran for Congress in 1992 in Texas in a majority black district. He lost that seat, and that convinced him that he lost because of the Voting Rights Act, which he thought protected minority candidates to the detriment of white candidates. And so he founded this Project on Fair Representation in 2005 to try to challenge the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act before Congress. It was initially housed at the American Enterprise Institute, obviously a very well-funded wing think tank, but subsequently it's become a project of this group that I mentioned called Donors Trust. And Donors Trust is basically a foundation where right-wing billionaires give a lot of money to. They've given they doled out $22 million in 2010 to a host of different right-wing groups: Grover Norquist Group, Americans for Our Prosperity, and also the American Legislative Exchange Council, known as ALEC, which was so influential in drafting mock voter ID laws for state legislators, which were introduced in state after state after state after 2010. So this group, Donors Trust, has given Blum $1.2 million from 2006 to 2011, and that's allowed him to hire, to first to find plaintiffs, then to hire lawyers to represent them. And the person who's arguing this case before the Supreme Court, which will be heard on February 27th, is the same lawyer, or I should say he comes from the same firm that also defended Ohio and Florida, where they attempted to restrict early voting. So, I mean, the same groups are part of this larger constellation to restrict voting rights, whether it's ALEC drafting mock voter ID laws and getting support from Donors Trust, or whether it's Donors Trust hiring lawyers who defended Ohio and Florida's failed attempts, I should add, to restrict early voting. These are the same people now that are backing this lawsuit that is before the Supreme Court on February 27th.